Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. My name's Tom Fard, and I organise Grand Rounds. And on occasion, we are joined to merge Grand Rounds in with talks of great import. And today is one of those occasions. And I'm going to be hugely brief and pass over to my colleague who's going to introduce the Douglas G. Adamson Memorial Lecture. I think we've been doing this for a couple of years as part of Grand Rounds in person. We do like to try and do it in person, and we have a good number of people in the audience here and 48 people online. And obviously, we'll post this to YouTube afterwards as well for those who can't make it in person. So this is always a highlight for me of the year. And I'm really looking forward to today's speaker, who's promised me he's going to talk about clarinets and music and all sorts of exciting things. So anyway, I shall pass on here to Samira, who's going to introduce the format. If you're on remotely on Zoom, please do mute your microphones. If you have a question, please do put it in the chat, or you can put your hand up at the end. And if you're in the audience, mute your microphones, but your video camera has to stay on. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Douglas Adamson Lecture. Today, we're honoured to welcome Professor Blair Smith, whose leadership in pain medicine has shaped not only research and policy across Scotland and beyond, but also the lived experiences of countless patients. His contributions to the understanding of the epidemiology, impact and management of chronic pain has been transformative, yet he brings to his work a deeply understated and humble manner. He was acknowledged by Clarivat as a highly cited researcher, top 0.1% globally in 2020, 2021, 2022 and 2024. He was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2023 and was chosen for the biennial Lady Margaret McKellen Award for Outstanding Contribution to Medical Science in Scotland in 2025. Professor Smith is widely known not just for the quality of his research, but the quality of his mentorship. He's someone who makes time for everyone, students, trainees, colleagues, and collaborators, offering guidance that is thoughtful, grounded, and unfailingly generous. Many of us here have benefited from his encouragement, his ability to listen carefully, and his talent for helping others see their own potential more clearly. His leadership is characterised by kindness, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to supporting those around him. This combination of scientific rigour, genuine humility, and deep care for people is rare. It's also precisely what makes Professor Smith such a fitting speaker for the Douglas Adamson Lecture, an event that honours individuals whose work and character enrich our community. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Blair Smith as he delivers this year's lecture.
Samira, thank you very much indeed. That's an incredibly generous introduction. I think I'm probably the wrong person. You've been speaking about somebody else here, so I'm apologise if you've just got me instead of the person that I barely recognise from that introduction. But it's a genuine honour to be here and a great privilege to be asked to deliver the Douglas G. Adamson. I've been told to emphasise the G in the Adamson in order to avoid mistaken identity. So Dr. Adamson was a consultant physician here in Tayside and an honorary senior lecturer at the University of Dundee. He graduated in 1938 from the University of, what's that place? Oh, St Andrews. It was in the days before we could get an MBCHB from Dundee, but he graduated and served with distinction almost immediately in the Second World War, where he was mentioned twice in dispatches for his anti-malarial organisation, which of course would have a huge impact on the military's ability to pursue their efforts. He came back from there. He served with honour as a consultant, but also as a teacher, a researcher, and an administrator. He was, of course, just as important as that, a husband and a father. Dougal and Graham are here today. Dougal remembers his father discussing scientific and statistical concepts with him when he was growing up and considering a career in medicine. So there are at least two other doctors. Patricia's not in medicine, but is not here today, but is also a distinguished output of Dr. Adamson's career. He was also an ornithologist, a painter, and a photographer, so a man of wide interests. He died suddenly at the age of 64, much to the regret of his colleagues and his patients. And the important thing about this lecture series and the Memorial Prize, which is also in his name, is that these weren't bequeathed through his will or through his family's efforts to prolong his name, but they were raised by subscription among his colleagues. So an indication of how popular and how much esteem Dr. Adamson was held during his career. And I think that's an example that we could all aspire to. So that's why I'm so honoured to be asked to deliver this lecture. And thank you to Samira and the committee for inviting me to be here. So today, I'd like to talk about chronic pain and epidemiology. And over the next wee while, we'll take you through some different aspects of that, highlighting some of our work, but our collaborators' work around the world. But we'll start, as is the tradition in epidemiology, with some definitions. Pain is an experience that we all have, but if we were asked to define it, we might have difficulty doing so. Fortunately, the International Association for the Study of Pain has already done that, and I think this is a very elegant definition: an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. So a very multidimensional experience, and this definition explains a lot of what we experience when we experience pain. Of course, acute pain is normally a life-saving, useful symptom that helps us to take ourselves out of danger or take action in response to pain. But chronic pain is defined as pain that persists or recurs beyond normal tissue healing time, which is taken to be 3 months, kind of arbitrarily. But the point about that being beyond normal tissue healing time is that chronic pain is pathological, whereas acute pain is very often a helpful instinct and symptomatic response. Chronic pain is important around the world. The Global Burden of Disease study, published here in 2016, but in subsequent years up to the present day, looks at the incidence and prevalence of years lived with disability of all these 328 diseases across the world, and consistently records chronic low back pain as the single greatest cause of disability in every country and continent worldwide. And although major depression is the second greatest cause of disability worldwide, 4 of the top 10 causes of chronic pain conditions and other important causes of years lived with disability are associated with chronic pain, such as diabetes and HIV. So worldwide, globally, this is by far and away the biggest cause of disability. So that's chronic pain. Epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in specified populations. And the second part, which is the most exciting part of the definition, is that it's the application of this study to control health problems. And that's why it's a clinically relevant discipline. One of the earliest, most famous examples of the second part of the definition is the Broad Street pump. This was during the 1854 outbreak of cholera in London, and John Snow, who was known for other aspects of anesthetics as well as epidemiology. This was before the time we knew the mechanisms of cholera, and the prevailing mechanism was that it was something to do with bad air, miasma. But Snow hypothesized that that wasn't the case. It was in some way related to water transmission. So he carried out a study of the distribution of the outbreak by conducting what's called shoe leather epidemiology. He walked around and spoke to locals, and he established that the pattern of outbreaks was very much focused on this water pump where people drew the water in Broad Street. And he persuaded the council to remove the handle of the water pump. And lo and behold, the cholera outbreak settled. So this was, remember, this was before the mechanism of cholera was known. Of course, subsequently we discovered the Vibrio cholerae, and the rest is history. And incidentally, many of the people who were experiencing cholera during that outbreak were taken to the Middlesex Hospital for treatment, where they may well have got one of the on-duty nurses who was a certain Florence Nightingale to treat them. But that's a different rabbit hole we can go down. So the epidemiological study of chronic pain can achieve all the features bullet pointed on this slide: the distribution and determinants, definition and classification, factors which lead to or favour chronicity and therefore help us with prevention and prognosis, and understanding the impact and quality of life, understanding the comorbidities, and then developing treatment strategies, and then allocating health service and educational resources. So a fairly basic science in the study of chronic pain. So first of all, let's start with the distribution. How common is chronic pain? And this was really the start of my research career when I joined the University of Aberdeen, which was 1993, and I was asked if I could help design a study which told us the prevalence of chronic pain. And fair enough, that was an intellectual challenge. I went in the fairly early days to a certain pain society in Britain, but I won't say what the name of the pain society was, went to a workshop there, which was exploring how we define chronic pain suitable for epidemiological study to determine its prevalence. The conclusion of the workshop was it's too complicated to define, it's too complicated to turn into a case definition questionnaire. We don't really need to know how prevalent it is. We know there's a lot of it out there, let's just get on with treating it. And there may be something to do with that, and certainly Dilbert maybe had taken that. They didn't have any accurate numbers, so he just made one up. Because studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than the ones you make up. And precisely 87 studies have shown that. But I was a graduate of the University of Glasgow, my alma mater, and Lord Kelvin was also there, and he had a slightly different view. He suggested that one's knowledge of science begins when he can measure what he is speaking about and express it in numbers. So we tried to take that line rather than a lot of it out there line. And to cut a long story short, at that time, we did develop this definition of chronic pain: intermittent or continuous pain or discomfort present for at least 3 months, and importantly, devised a case definition questionnaire, and we validated it in a small study before putting it to the main study we put to, which was in Grampian at the time, Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, and amazingly for nowadays looking at these kind of studies with a response rate of over 82%, we found that the prevalence of this very broad definition of chronic pain was 46.5%, so almost a normal part of the human experience. But we also added in measures of severity. A 4-point scale, the chronic pain grade, and chronic pain grade 4 is intense, highly disabling chronic pain, and the prevalence of that with these validated questionnaires was 5.6%. So that's kind of in the same ballpark as things like cancer, heart disease, depression. And yet, if you look at the funding and attention that chronic pain has received even since then, there's no comparison at all, despite the disability this causes. We published that in the Lancet, and I'll come back to refer to this study. This was in 1999, so a long time ago, but it still has a life of its own. And these we've put to the numbers of people in the health board areas at the time that were experiencing this severe, intense, disabling chronic pain in each of the health board areas, to put some figures onto the size of the problem that the health boards were having to deal with. As I said, that was in 1999. Since then, other studies have been conducted in the UK. That was the first one, possibly worldwide, really, with the validated questionnaire. But the subsequent systematic reviews have tended to come up with similar figures. In the UK, prevalence of population pooled estimate of 43%. And severe pain, this is grade 3 and 4, 10 to 14%, so the same kind of ballpark. However, if we take different definitions, and this one is in different studies in Europe with a more stringent definition, which is pain for at least 6 months, experienced in the last month and several times during the last week, with an intensity of at least 5 on a 10-point numeric rating scale. The prevalence was lower, but look at the variety there, 12% in Spain to 30% in Norway, with UK near the lower end of the spectrum at 13%. And as with the UK, a systematic review of pain prevalence studies in Europe published last year has again found this huge range in prevalence from 12% to 48% in population prevalence in studies conducted in Europe, and these other ranges there that you can see in the slide. The authors suggested that this variation was because of different definitions of chronic pain, and that there's a certain amount to be said for that, and that if we were able to agree a consistent definition, we might be able to get a more precise figure to deal with. But here's a study worldwide, 52 studies using this fairly straightforward, just one question in a much larger health questionnaire, but this was the presence of moderate, severe or extreme pain anytime in the last 30 days compared with none or mild pain, and even huge, bigger range there from just under 10% in China to just over 50% in Morocco. So even when we have the same definition, we have a huge range in prevalence. And what's the reasons for these ranges in prevalence? Well, there are methodological differences, such as case definitions. Once we've got the definition, how we determine who has pain according to that definition, that's so-called ascertainment. And then how we sample the population that we question and how we survey them once we've got them. But of course, there are actual differences in pain prevalence. The time might change over time, but different as we've seen in different places, and differences in the groups of people that we surveyed. So to an extent, we're left with the where we started with the Pain Society in Britain's declaration or conclusion that there's a lot of it out there and we just need to get on with it. But certainly from the Scottish perspective, way back just after 1999, of course, I was a young academic full of passion and belief in the validity of my research. And so, of course, I went straight to the Scottish executive, as it was at the time, rather than government. And we went, spoke to Malcolm Chisholm and his team to explain not just the prevalence, but the impact and the associated factors of chronic pain and how the health service should be looking at this as a distinct condition. He took some time to deliberate over it, but this was his eventual response to a health committee in this case, that ring fencing of funds is difficult to justify. To put it simply, he said, chronic pain is a symptom, not a disease. So let's think about that for a while. Is chronic pain a single global entity, or is it just a convenient diagnostic umbrella under which we shelter from a wide range of disease entities, all of which need different attention, therefore can't be combined together? I like to think of this, like Dr. Adamson, I enjoy ornithology, and compared to if we think about the number of known species of birds, this slide says 11,000. If we go by the Cornell laboratories, there's actually 11,361 species of birds, 300 of which are hummingbirds, by the way. But actually, there are other thinking thinks that there's up to 20,000 species, and the thing there is it depends on how you define species. So back to a circular argument. Anyway, there's a huge number of species of birds. But I came across this letter to the Times a few years ago by an author who said that people who are unable to identify birds, there are only 3 kinds of birds: little fluttery ones, big flappy ones, and ducks. And it may be that if you're interested in stopping birds eating your crops or making a mess of your car, that's all you need to know about them. And perhaps if we're treating pain, certainly with drugs, all we need to know at the outset is it's neuropathic or it's not neuropathic, because that determines your initial choice of treatment and drugs. And there's a certain amount to be said for that. And certainly most recently, the World Health Organization, through its International Classification of Diseases, the 11th revision, which came into force on January 22nd, and I was involved with this work. For the first time, WHO recognizes chronic pain as a disease in its own right, and it divides it into primary pain and secondary pain. So these are the wee flappy ones and the big, the big flappy ones and the wee fluffery ones. And it's not rocket science. It says that, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It says that chronic pain is pain that persists or recurs for longer than 3 months, and that takes us right back to the IESP definition. But the important thing is it identifies it as its own entity. Chronic primary pain is a new consideration now. It never previously existed, and this is defined here. It's basically pain that's associated with significant emotional distress or functional disability, or both, and that cannot be better explained by another chronic pain condition. And this accounts for a lot of the chronic pain that we meet in the clinical situation. Chronic secondary pain is listed here. It's cancer-related, post-surgical, other causes where we know the underlying cause. And one of these other causes is neuropathic pain. I'm just highlighting this here because it's a lot of the work that we do in the chronic pain research group here in Dundee is around neuropathic pain. Neuropathic pain is pain caused by disease or damage in the nervous system, and it can be divided into peripheral or central neuropathic pain. So that's chronic pain. What about its impact and its comorbidities? Because this is where we're dealing with in the clinical scenario. Now, there's a lot of epidemiology going into this slide, and it doesn't really do it justice to summarize it in a single slide, but you can see all of these factors are associated with chronic pain. The socio-demographic factors, age and gender, there are lifestyle factors listed there, smoking and alcohol. There are clinical factors such as other illnesses, particularly pain elsewhere, and there are childhood and genetic factors. A lot of this is our own epidemiology, a lot of this is colleagues around the world, but what's important here is that a lot of these, clearly not all of them like genetics, but a lot of them have what's called bidirectional etiology. And by that, we mean that these factors bring on chronic pain or make it worse. And when you have chronic pain, these factors become more prevalent. So for example, if you have chronic pain, you're more likely to drink more alcohol, but if you drink more alcohol, then your chronic pain might be worse. And the same is true of mental illness, for example, and many of these others. And so we think about chronic pain with the biopsychosocial model, where biological, psychological, and social factors contribute to chronic pain. And if I was designing this graphic, I would put the arrows in the other direction as well, where chronic pain also contributes to factors in each of these three domains. I mentioned here briefly the Scottish Intercollegiate Guideline Network, which guideline on chronic pain, the revision of which was published in December last year. And that's where this diagram is taken from, and where the evidence for managing chronic pain is considered in these three domains. Looking at one of these briefly just now, adverse childhood experiences. ACEs are potentially stressful events or environments that occur before the age of 18, such as abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, a wide range of other factors, which we can't go into in detail just now. But Karen Nicholson, a GP that worked with us, led us in this systematic review that found 68 studies that examined the possible association of ACEs with chronic pain, and 200,000 participants confirmed the association in a dose-response way. So the more adverse experiences you'd had as a child, the greater the intensity and the greater the extent of your chronic pain. And this was likely mediated by mental health. But not only mental health, because Dan Saratny, who's here today, an anaesthetist, led us in this systematic review and another program of work that he's leading, which looks at the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and your response and experiences with analgesic medication. And a similar number of studies and participants found that people who had ACEs had a greater use of analgesia, more use of greater instance of side effects, and therefore probably the painkillers don't work so much. I'm going to come back to that word I slipped in there accidentally. And greater risk of side effects and drug overdose. And Professor Tim Hales here at the university is leading an international program of research. He calls it Consortium Against Pain Inequality, but it's focusing on the role and the mechanisms and the potential approaches to the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and chronic pain. Chronic pain doesn't occur by itself. Comorbidities, these are our friends in Australia that published this work, and they do a lot of work on the comorbidities of chronic pain, multimorbidity, which is the current term, but this graph shows the percentage of people with each of these conditions along the bottom that have significant chronic pain. But it's not just that you have one of these, it's the more extensive your chronic pain. If you have pain, this graph shows pain at 3 or more sites, then you have an average of at least 3 comorbidities alongside that chronic pain. So you're not dealing just with chronic pain, you're dealing with multimorbidity in most people with chronic pain. Looking at one of these, chronic pain and depression, it's worth considering this separately because as we've said, chronic pain after chronic pain, depression is the second greatest cause of disability worldwide. It's the commonest comorbidity of depression. Chronic pain is 52% of those attending pain clinics have major depression, and 65% of those with major depression have pain symptoms. And the combination of these two, of pain and depression, leads to poorer treatment outcomes and function. That's illustrated by this US study, where the blue bars in each of these graphs represent people with no pain and depression. The yellow bars, people with both pain and depression. And you can see that the co-occurrence of those leads much more likely than either of them alone to poor health, visits to healthcare professionals, overnight stays in hospital, and to any functional limitation. These two photographs are from from my own work. This pile of records is obviously pre-COVID, when we were still dealing with paper medical records. And this is a pile of records from just 3 patients, and the wee thin one in the middle is one of those patients. So top and bottom are 2 patients who are coming to the pain clinic for the first time, about to meet me at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, well, 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning. This is the first time in the pain clinic, but each of these slips of paper represents an encounter with the NHS Tayside, and therefore there's a huge story to tell. And it emphasised to me, of course, I couldn't read these cover to cover between 8:30 and 9 o'clock before they came in, but it gives an indication of the backstory that comes with them when they come to see me. The diagram on the left was drawn by one of our patient partners in one of our research projects, and we were asking her to bring her experience of chronic pain to our research work. But she felt unable to do this because all these other things were going on with her as an individual, and she couldn't isolate the chronic pain. She talked about fatigue and brain fog, and in her case, anemia, costochondritis, irritable bowel syndrome. And she was exhorting us to look at the whole person, the whole illness and personal experience, rather than trying to isolate the chronic pain. And of course, it has other significant effects. Remember the Lancet study we followed these people up after 10 years of a one-off report of chronic pain and found that they were more likely to have died 10 years later. Any chronic pain, 1.38 times more likely, severe chronic pain up to twice as likely, and particularly to have died from heart disease or respiratory disease. That's illustrated in these graphs here. So the question is, what do we do about chronic pain? Well, I said we've got to take a biopsychosocial approach to it. I've got here a model of chronic pain, how we might consider how it works. So we're starting on the left. We've got an underlying medical condition or injury which causes chronic pain. Our task is to find the correct painkiller so the patient can end up pain-free. Our task as the medical profession is to diagnose the condition and to treat the condition. And that's all we're expected to do, perhaps. But as we've already seen, other factors are associated with chronic pain in a bidirectional way. Here we've listed social circumstances, financial pressure, and so on, that exist independently, perhaps, of the underlying condition. There are also these factors which affect the success of treatment, expectations of treatments, pre-existing genetic factors and previous experience, and your ability to self-manage that pain and the management of other conditions. And so sometimes, of course, we can't diagnose the underlying condition, or if we can't treat it, and that breaks off this arrow. Very often, we can't find the correct analgesic, or it's unable to be tolerated, so that pathway is removed from us. And this link between the previous experiences and the possibility of being pain-free often works in a negative way, and further hampers the chances of being pain-free. And so actually, this model, which I based in the first instance, is actually how chronic pain never works. We've got to find another model, and this is a proposition, a fairly straightforward one, but the important thing here is the box on the right, where we're not aiming to have patients live pain-free, but to live with the pain, remembering, taking into cognizance these other circumstances. And that involves multidisciplinary approaches to the factors in the bubble on the left, and to the expectations and experience. And there's judicious use of medication and intervention, but it's not the whole story. More importantly, perhaps, is this effort to try and turn this into a positive loop, living with pain and the experience of managing pain, so that we start at a low point and gradually work our way up to the ability to live successfully with pain. So that even when we don't diagnose the condition or can't treat it, we still have the ability to manage pain. These multidisciplinary approaches, this diplomatically derived STEM sentence here, they include some or all of the following, but are not restricted to, and that's in case of anybody here in a group that I've not quite mentioned here. But the important thing is it's a multidisciplinary approach, teamwork to managing chronic pain, involving all these disciplines, and importantly, at the bottom, how you manage it yourself, how you live with pain yourself, self-management. And these treatment approaches should be patient-centered, evidence-based, involve shared decision-making, and of course, safe. A wee while ago, I slipped the word painkiller into my talk. Painkillers don't exist, at least according to this NHS campaign, and this is an attempt to move the medical profession and people living with pain away from the attempt to completely relieve pain, completely get rid of pain by the use of drugs, because often it leads to an unattainable ambition so that people take more and higher doses of painkillers and just end up with side effects, and dangerous side effects very often, and emphasizes the need for these other multidisciplinary approaches. But thinking of analgesics for a while, these are two separate pharmacoepidemiological studies that we conducted in Scotland. The top one looks at the prescribing of opioids over a 10-year period, and the bottom one looks at the prescribing of gabapentinoids, slightly more modern drugs used to treat neuropathic pain. And you can see that in both cases, prescribing was going up enough. It was common enough in the first place in opioids, but it was going up and up over the time. And this ties in with our knowledge from the United States of the so-called opioid epidemic. And this was associated with drug-related deaths as well. It's a serious consequence. But looking at it the other side, this is the Generation Scotland study, where we took a snapshot of reports of pain, and we were able to look at prescribing 6 months before and 6 months after. And on the positive side, we showed that there was a significant association between pain severity and the receipt of opioid prescriptions. So generally, prescribing was appropriate. But we also surprisingly discovered perhaps that 53% of those who reported severe pain, grade 4, received no opioid prescription. This is grade 3 or 4, sorry. And 40% in that year's period, despite severe pain, had received no analgesic at all. So perhaps as an indication of under-treatment as well as potential over-treatment. In any case, we first published the SIGN guideline in 2013, first edition of the SIGN guideline, and we made some clear recommendations about the prescribing of opioids, basically highlighting their danger and recommending that they be restricted a little. And that was, the SIGN guideline was the first comprehensive evidence-based national guideline for chronic pain anywhere internationally. So we hope it would have some impact. Harry Hebert, who's here as well, looked at one aspect of the impact, and he looked at the rates of prescribing of opioids in an uninterrupted time series analysis and found that there was a change in the rate of prescribing. This is number of prescription items per 1,000 population. And coincident with the publication of our SIGN guideline, we found that the rate began to fall. That was in 2020, was when we were able to look up to the peers prescribing rates more recently since June 2023 of opioids in the top and gabapentinoids in the bottom. And you can see that they've maybe not continued the decline, but they've at least stopped their increase, which was what we had discovered up until 2013. Here, Tayside prescribing rates in comparison with the mean Scottish rates were slightly above average, but still within the 95% confidence interval. Anyway, we've published the SIGN guideline update December last year. I led the opioid section, and these are the more restrictive formal recommendations that we've made. These are among the recommendations, most importantly of which is that opioids should not be considered routinely for people with chronic non-malignant pain. There's some role for them in carefully selected people, but only very short term and with frequent and early review. And that anyone who's getting them at these actually quite high doses, but not as high as we often see or saw them in the clinic, 90 milligrams morphine equivalent today, should be under care of a pain specialist. The SIGN guideline, most evidence for the greatest effectiveness of any treatment modality or management modality for chronic pain was physical activity. In 2017, we published a Cochrane review of the role of effectiveness of physical activity in chronic pain and established that it was safe and effective. And that ties in with the more recent SIGN guideline. Callum Lees, who's another GP, led us in this systematic review, looking, of course, most people with chronic pain don't participate in significant physical activity, and we wondered why. So we looked at all the studies that had examined that in the past, looking at barriers and facilitators to physical activity in the presence of chronic pain. It won't be surprising to you here, perhaps, the impact of pain, comorbidities, not knowing the benefits and time constraints are barriers, and there's some facilitators here that are important to recognise. Leslie Colvin, who's unable to be here today because she's at this moment conducting her own pain clinic across the corridor, but she's leading this study, which has been going for the last few years, which is attempting to build our knowledge and understanding of these barriers and facilitators into a personalised approach to promoting physical activity among people with chronic pain. And this, the evidence suggests, if we can do it effectively, will greatly improve chronic pain and improve the uptake of physical activity. So let's think about mechanisms of chronic pain. We didn't know a great deal about these when I started back in 1993, but we'll explore some of these, focusing on genetics mostly because that's most of what I've looked at here, but of course there are other mechanisms. First of all, is chronic pain heritable? Can we look at it as a genetic condition? The Scottish Family Health Study, Generation Scotland, which I mentioned before, is a family study. We recruited in family groups, and we were able to look at the heritability of several conditions, including chronic pain. And any chronic pain we found was 29% of the variance of its occurrence was attributable to the heritability to family structure. And even after we adjusted for household effects, in other words, growing up together, and other factors listed here, age and gender and so on, the heritability was 16%. And much greater heritability if we only considered severe chronic pain. So there's definitely a strong genetic contribution to the occurrence of chronic pain. We focused on neuropathic pain in this study. Abby Belachamy, who's here today, led another systematic review looking at the known associated factors of genetic factors associated with the occurrence of neuropathic pain. At that time, she identified 29 studies. thinking back to the beginning, in these 29 studies, there were 29 different ways of identifying chronic pain, so 29 different phenotypes, but nonetheless was able to identify 28 genes, some of which, 6 of which occurred in more study, and she's led 3 more updates of that review. Those 28 genes occurred in these 4 pathways, ion channels, which are involved in nerve transmission, particularly neurotransmission at nerve cells, metabolism, and the immune response. So these seem to be among the most important mechanisms of neuropathic pain. One of the studies she identified was the first genome-wide association study of neuropathic pain, which our former colleague Wei Wa Meng conducted with us here in Dundee. This is a Manhattan plot. If you're not familiar with it, it identifies the 22 chromosomes, not including the sex chromosomes. Each dot represents a genetic variant, and the higher up the graph it is, the more significantly it's associated with the condition under question, in this case, neuropathic pain among diabetes in the GODARS population, identified by the receipt of specific drugs and evidence of nerve damage by monofilament testing. And here he found a gene on chromosome 8, which reached a suggestive association. Incidentally, it's called a Manhattan plot because of its supposed resemblance to the Manhattan skyline, with the skyscrapers along the skyline. And you can see that in this case, the actual Manhattan skyline replicated the findings in chromosome 28 that Wei Wa made. Much later on, this is Abby's work again, taking a different phenotype definition in the GODARS population, combining that with the Generation Scotland cohort, which we've referred to recently, and also with a slightly different but comparable definition in the UK Biobank, which is a study of 500,000 people across the UK. Did a genome-wide association study. This is to cut a very long story short, Abby, apologies, but identified this one gene which reached genome-wide significance, SLC25A3. This encodes a mitochondrial phosphate carrier at the cell membrane and is involved in cell metabolism. And again, I'm not going to the details of this, but Abby did some further research and established that there was biological plausibility for the association of this with the occurrence of neuropathic pain because of its role in metabolism, because of its association with other known pain-related genes, and because of findings in rodent models of nerve injury pain. But she quite rightly concluded that the functional study of the gene is essential to find its causal role. Another genome-wide association study, this is the Dollar-Risk Consortium. This was funded by the European Union, Horizon 2020, and it's a collaboration led from Oxford, but to which Dundee contributed. And we were able to assemble cohorts of people who had diabetic neuropathy nerve damage and look at the pain associated with that nerve damage and the pain intensity with a harmonized phenotype. So going back to the previous variation, where we eliminated that variation. And in this genome-wide association study, we identified KCNT2, which is a potassium channel gene, again involved in potassium ion transport at cell membranes, which is a mechanism hypothesized to be involved in pain. With this cohort, we were able to conduct clinical examination. This is quantitative sensory testing, 9 different modalities of response to pain, different types of pain processing. And you can see here that we're able to divide the members of the cohort into those that carried the KCNT2 variant and those that didn't. And in one of the pain modalities, mechanical pain sensitivity, you can see there's a significant difference in how pain was experienced by those who carried this gene compared to those who didn't. So evidence that there's this is a pathway worth following as we look to mechanisms and therefore drug discovery. Almost finally in the mechanisms, this is back to the UK Biobank. It was 500,000 in the first instance, but they defined pain, but not in a previously tested or validated way. It wasn't a particularly helpful pain questionnaire. So along with Dave Bennett and these other 2 colleagues, we went to Biobank and persuaded them to let us design and develop a validated, detailed questionnaire to send out to members of the cohort to identify and characterize chronic pain in a more valid way. And that questionnaire was based on the case definition questionnaire that we created for the Lancet study back in 1999. That forms the basis of this one. And it was completed by 167,000 people. that we reported the epidemiology of neuropathic pain based on that questionnaire, the largest epidemiological study of this nature to date. And fortunately, we assured ourselves that the prevalence and associated factors were similar to those which had been discovered in previous smaller studies. But the next part of this is that we were then able to conduct genome-wide association studies of pain intensity using this very broad definition here. And we were able to do that and replicate it in 2 international studies. So there's these 2 hits. I'm going to focus on this one, SLC45A4, which was found to be of genome-wide significance with pain intensity, the intensity of pain which is present. So this SLC45A4 gene was found to be expressed in the dorsal root ganglions of mouse models, and dorsal root ganglions in the spinal cord. It's crucial in the processing of pain between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, so evidence that it's a biological plausibility. The next couple of slides are not mine because it's taken us beyond the expertise of our collaborators, but these are collaborators at Oxford who were able to look at SLC45A4, and they were able to determine that it was a polyamine, membrane polyamine receptor. Polyamines are involved in transcription, translation, cell signaling, and they've been implicated in lots of conditions, including neurological disorders like stroke and epilepsy. So again, biological plausibility. There have been intracellular polyamine receptors identified before, but never previously a membrane receptor, although it was presumed that they existed. So that in itself is a first. Taking that to the next stage, now that this gene seems to be associated, what happens if we knock out that gene? So they were able to develop mice which no longer expressed SLC45A4, knockout mice, and they determined through mouse experiments that the knockout mice had a slower reaction to pain signals, heat, mechanical and chemical, and reduced pain behavior, lower pain behavior than the wild type mice that expressed the gene fully, or heterogeneous mice that expressed one copy in one gene and not in the other. So significant, important evidence here of demonstrable difference in pain sensitivity, which is furthered by, again, mechanical pain sensitivity testing, again in mice. And Stephen Middleton was able to show that the mice needed greater pain induction to activate pain nerves and pain processing. So this may be an important finding in understanding mechanisms and the potential treatment of pain. This is the working model that together we've put up. I say we, it's mostly them, but the working model is SLC45A4 regulates polyamine transport across neuronal membranes, and that regulates ion channels and nociceptor function, influencing pain sensitivity. And this means that there's a potential, as demonstrated in mice, that if we knock out that gene in the same way that the handle was removed from the Broad Street water pump, we may have an approach to reducing pain sensitivity, or at least influencing pain sensitivity. Of course, there's a long way to go from there to where we want to be in terms of treatment and understanding, but we do have a potential pathway to go. We published that in Nature last year, and colleagues mainly at Oxford are taking it further to the next stage. So that's about all I have to say here. These are the conclusions, just to summarize. Chronic pain is common, multifactorial, and disabling worldwide. Epidemiology is crucial in its understanding and management needs multidimensional, multidisciplinary approaches. Painkillers don't exist, but neuro approaches such as physical activity are essential, and genetic studies giving some important clues. I'll conclude by acknowledging these, among other colleagues, that again include but are not restricted to members of the following group, including here at Dundee, the Chronic Pain Research Group, some of whom are here, others of whom are online. Our collaborations mainly with Oxford, Dolorisk and Painstorm, funded by the Advanced Pain Discovery Platform, Neuropathic Pain Special Interest Group, Biobank, GAPA, which is the Global Alliance of Partners for Pain Advocacy, bringing the lived experience voice into understanding, managing and researching pain. I had the privilege of co-chairing. This is the Chronic Pain Research Group, as they were fairly recently. You might recognise some faces around the room. Finally, though, when I was asked to give this lecture, I was told that it was awarded to somebody in recognition of excellence in patient care, and Samira will confirm with my instinct was to get back to you and say, well, I can't accept this because for a start, I've not been providing clinical care and Tayside patient care for more than nearly 3 years now. And secondly, even when I was, it was at a very minimal whole-time equivalent. Most of my time was in the university. She went back and spoke to people, but went back to the original papers and found that it had been extended to recognition of research. And so I was very honoured to accept it. And hopefully some of that has been shown today. But there are some people who do provide excellent patient care in Tayside. I acknowledge, first of all, the NHS Tayside Pain Service, which I was privileged to be a part of, but I'm not including myself in this acknowledgement. Every single member from every single clinical discipline was not only expert in managing pain and managing people, they were humane and they were compassionate and really cared about the work and the people that they were treating. And it was an honour to learn from working with them. But secondly, the other individuals here are at a more personal level, people who worked in the NHS Tayside Cancer Centre, as Dougal did until a few years ago. Dougal and Graham, I should have acknowledged here, Dr. Adamson's sons here. But Dougal didn't actually know I was there, but Sharon Armstrong, Doreen Ziai, Francesca Polignano, Cameron Weir, surgeons, oncologists, anaesthetists, without whom I wouldn't be here today. And that is the truth. And of course, many more. So thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the legacy that Dr. Adamson has left us. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
And although you will deliver here, you have impacted very many patients over the years. So, but I have some questions. Can I firstly ask you, you highlighted to us how important chronic pain is, how overarching it is.
Yep, sorry.
I'll go back into the camera. There you go.
What is the role of chronic pain?
Right, so chronic pain by a registry, you mean a list of everybody who in the population perhaps who has. So you've struck on a really important research theme of ours and our recognition that because we can't identify in the population who has chronic pain, it's very difficult at a local and a national level to target treatment, to conduct research, to look at the effect of treatment or health care improvement, and to recruit for trials which are crucial in improving the management of pain. So yes, we do need a registry. The difficulty is how to define chronic pain, as we've experienced in this lecture. One of the ways of doing that is through the receipt of analgesic medications through primary care records in the NHS. We cover most 96% of the population. So if we can find a way through primary care registries of identifying those with chronic pain, then that's an approach to it. Of course, as I've also highlighted, not everybody, many people with chronic pain don't receive a medication, so it's not a straightforward way of doing it. We're leading a project called See Picture. Jan Drew's involved in that, Arlene, others involved in that, where we're testing an algorithm to go into primary care health record systems and identify, partly through prescribing, but through a range of read-coded, ultimately SNOMED-coded conditions associated with chronic pain. And we're testing the validity with a view to tweaking that. We've just been reading Jan Drew's draft paper of the initial testing of that, and it looks like that's going to be a very helpful, sensitive and positive predictive value approach towards doing it. And I think that would be a huge advantage.
You need your microphone for the audience at home. That was the final question. Looking to the future, what do you think the big advantages are we want to do? And the second one is to do a lot of things that they do to keep it impossible.
Thank you. I'm not sure if that came across the microphone, but the questions were the next big advance in chronic pain and how do we get beyond the disease model and look at prevention of chronic pain? And those two questions are actually very closely related to each other, Rory. I think if we think back to the second version of the model of chronic pain that I presented, and that was really trying to get away from the disease model. And I think a lot of our efforts should be focusing now on non-pharmacological treatment and non-pathology, non-biological basis of the understanding of chronic pain to get into the physical, the psychological, the social, the spiritual, other dimensions of chronic pain, which people are now beginning to understand, sometimes reluctantly. It takes a bit of work to get to that stage with people, particularly in the pain clinic. If we can get that back to an early stage before they go through that big pile of records and come more early to an understanding that chronic pain, as we've shown, it's almost a normal part of being a human with 46% affected. If we can get understanding at that stage before it gets to the 5.6%, and there's some work going on in there. So, for example, the work that Leslie's leading on the role of physical activity and lifestyle medicine in chronic pain. So that is then related to the prevention. I don't think we'll necessarily prevent chronic pain, but we may prevent it from getting from grade 1 to grade 4 through earlier understanding and intervention. And that involves shared discussions and shared understanding, which is quite a big leap from where many people are just now. Of course, as I also highlighted at the beginning, there are, in comparison with conditions of equivalent disability and prevalence, there's a lot less resource allocated to chronic pain clinics and pain provision in primary and secondary care. So we do need to seriously look at that. That's a political decision. There's no money anywhere at the moment. In order for that to come to chronic pain services, we've got to take it away from somewhere else. And I don't see you volunteering to sacrifice some of the diabetes funding in order to do that.
Them's fighting words. The other microphone has run out of batteries, so I'm holding this in a strange manner. There is a question, I think, on the chat, so if we just jump to this. Tim is expressing his gratitude for working with you many
Just
times.
because I name dropped him.
That's right. Just stick his name up there. He's attention seeking. Nicola here says, thank you for that interesting and informative talk. Do you think there is a role of nutrition in the management of chronic pain? For example, recent evidence emerging of the role of nutrition in the management of other chronic diseases, CKD, diabetes, CVD, etc. Thank
you, Nicola. I think that's a great question. And clearly there's a unquestionable role of nutrition in, well, diabetes is the obvious one you've used there, and diabetes is something like a quarter of people with diabetes experience neuropathic pain. So, and it's known that the worse the diabetic control, the more greater the likelihood of presence of neuropathic pain. In terms of nutrition to manage chronic pain itself, as you said, as you saw, we just published the updated version of the SIGN guideline. We looked at randomized controlled trials of nutritional-based interventions in chronic pain. At the moment, there wasn't convincing evidence of nutritional intervention leading to improved outcomes in chronic pain. That's partly because of the number and the quality of the trials involved in nutrition. It's notoriously difficult to conduct nutritional trials because it's difficult to control the intervention. But at the moment, there isn't distinct evidence. But we do know that there's a link between obesity, overweight, BMI, and chronic pain and other conditions. So instinctively, we would advocate for healthy nutrition and lifestyle, but I can't point to any specific nutritional intervention for which there's evidence of benefit.
One more question from Tim. Trauma-informed pain management is a major area of interest, and yet uptake is limited. What do you see as the best way forward?
So, Tim, thank you very much for planting that grenade after the compliment. By trauma-informed pain management, I think you're thinking of the association with adverse childhood experiences and the recognition that people with adverse experiences in childhood are more likely to experience chronic pain, and therefore the importance of clinicians for recognizing that when we come to speaking to our patients. It certainly was clear to me when I was working in the pain clinic that two of the most prevalent experiences that people came to us with, one was childhood trauma, particularly experience of abuse, and the other one was ongoing problematic grief. Those two experiences were very strongly, in my personal experience, associated with chronic pain. And part of being a pain clinician is to understand the person that you're speaking to and understand their experience. And a large part of the management is, first of all, hearing their story and then reflecting on that story. So I think at a personal level, I think it's important to be informed about backgrounds such as trauma. In terms of providing formal trauma-informed pain management or trauma-informed care, I probably don't have enough expertise to make an informed comment about that. There are others here, like Dan, who have thought about it in greater detail. I'm not going to put you in the spot, Dan, but there are people thinking about it, and it's an important thing to consider.
Okay, well, we've approached 2 o'clock, so the only thing that remains is to hand over the certificate, which they can just about catch on camera. So once again, thanks very much to Blair for an amazing talk and a career of amazing work here in Tayside, helping countless people. And it's amazing, really, all those papers. Here's one of the papers I did in Nature. Anyway, congratulations and thanks very much.
Thank you, Larry. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Should have said that the biggest achievement of the day was you sorting out the IT at the beginning under pressure.
Well, yeah.